First of all, a warm welcome to everybody, to the attendees and panelists, and thank you for your interest in our panel. But I think one panelist is missing. There he is. Yeah, first, we are most fortunate today to have on our panel an exciting mix of entrepreneurs, representatives from the 2 regulatory authorities, and one policymaker. I would first like to introduce Claire Kütemeier from BaFin, the German Financial Supervisory Authority. Claire Kütemeier has been with BaFin for more than 10 years, regulating financial service firms since 2005. Our second panelist, Jochen Metzger, head of the Department Payments and Settlement Systems, Deutsche, Bundesbank. Let me continue with Dr. Levin Holle, Director General of the Financial Markets Policy Department of the German Federal Ministry of Finance. Dr. Holle is also responsible for the supervision of the Financial Market Stabilization Authority and BaFin. And an interesting side note is that Dr. Holle, prior to his joining the ministry, worked for Boston Consulting Group for 15 years. On my other side, I'm very pleased to introduce to you 2 prominent fintech entrepreneurs. André Bajorat is a rather young fintech veteran. He was a former managing director at Geoplay, a member of the board of directors at Starfinance, and today he holds the position of CEO of Figo. And I think he will say some words about Figo later. I'm quite sure about this. Last but not least, it's not a pitch. Not a pitch. We are also fortunate to welcome Joachim Schmidt, co-founder and current managing director of BANCALIS, which is based here in Frankfurt. And he just explained to me the business model of BANCALIS, which is quite interesting for banks because it helps them to understand and to affect how they can deal with the regulatory framework. But I think we will explain this to us in more detail. From the last panel, we learned about the importance of the regulatory framework and how to establish a fintech hub worldwide, in Germany, in other countries. But we also learned that there are some countries ahead. Countries like the UK, like Israel, the United States, Hong Kong and Singapore and others. And perhaps one important point is that in contrast to Germany, politicians in the UK, like David Cameron or the Mayor of London, are pressing ahead with fintechs. For example, Barkov Consulting counted only 17 fintech initiatives during the last months in the UK, headed, for example, by the City of London or the British government. So I think this ball lies in your playing field, Dr. Holle, and we all agreed that every panelist has the opportunity to give a short introduction to the topic, and I would like to ask you to start. So, what is the approach of the Ministry of Finance to fintechs? Is there anything in the pipeline?
Those are already 3 questions in one.
Yeah, that's true.
But in order to not to cover the full length of the program with the first statement, I'll focus on your first part. I think that makes most sense. I think the initial question you have is how does a ministry, a policy maker, a regulator look at this topic? And I think from a general perspective, we look at the market, we look what does it mean for customers, for the economy in Germany, for the stability of the markets. I think what is very important, and perhaps sometimes in Germany we not always do it that way, we should begin by looking at the chances and should not begin by looking only or focusing only on the risks. I think there are really a lot of chances in these new developments for customers, and all of you here are much more versed than I am in what this means in concrete in terms of increase in customer value, increase in convenience for consumers. So it's not only a price issue. I think speed of services will go up and has the potential to go up enormously. And we will have the chance to give consumers access to services, wealth of information, which they did not have in the past. So I think there's a huge chance in increase in customer value, which is important for consumers, which is therefore also important for policymakers. There are other areas which have an impact more on the back office of banks or the interaction of financial institutions among each others. Let me mention blockchain. That's not so much in the consumer focus, but that's of course also a very important chance for improving value of these services. So I think there are a lot of chances in this. We certainly should do everything we can to make that development as good as possible. I think some may think that the financial services industry compared to other industries moves only very slowly if we compare to IT or media or telecom, but I think we will see that this change will accelerate dramatically and everybody should be prepared to go with that. Now, I think as regulators and policymakers, of course, we also have a responsibility to look at the risks for financial stability, for consumers. Not all business models will work. Some will fail. Some consumers will find out that not everything that was promised to them has been realized. So I think we also need to keep that in mind. Now, what does that mean for a ministry? I think for a ministry it means we should not, and we certainly do not think that we are the better entrepreneurs and we know these are the right ideas, and let's launch an initiative which says these 3 ideas, these 3 fintechs are the ones which we should promote. I think that would be wrong. The market has to address that. I think the responsibility of the ministry is to set an adequate regulatory framework for these companies to give them the chance to develop. I think that's extremely important. That also means that if a certain type of business has the same type of features as existing traditional business and is the same type of risks to the market, to the financial stability in total, or to consumers, it should be regulated in the same way. On the other hand, and that is the big challenge for us, and I'm happy to go into that into more detail a bit later, it's a huge challenge also for regulators and supervisors to adapt. They are not very prone to reacting extremely quickly to technological changes or IT developments. The whole regulatory framework we have is based on existing paper-based businesses, existing business models which have been developed over decades. So that's what's in the legislation, that's what's in the mind of legislators and supervisors, and I think that we have to change. I think that's a big challenge. We're working on that. I'm happy to go into some of the examples later on.
Thank you very much. So I think this leads us to the regulator's perspective.
Great, thank you. From BaFin's point of view, first of all, I would like to point out that yes, fintechs have come into our focus, and this is something we're looking at. Fintechs in all their different forms, whether they might be providing investment services or payment services or lending services or any other type of services. And as it has been already said in the opening statement, yes, you can talk to us, to BaFin. We are open for all questions, and we will try to help all fintechs through licensing procedures or other procedures that they might have to go through, or other questions that might arise for them, whether they fall within the regulatory scope or not. We are aware of the fact that the regulatory landscape might be a bit complicated in some cases, and that it's very difficult to navigate through this landscape without having a discussion partner on BaFin's side. So this is something where we definitely aim to support the fintechs. But what I also need to point out, and I want to make this statement right at the beginning, because we're often compared to the UK FCA, and it's been said in the previous panel's discussions today already that the UK has a much more or better environment for fintechs than Germany does. The thing is, BaFin's scope of competences and responsibilities is somewhat different to that of the UK FCA. We cannot privilege certain firms over others. We need to treat all firms the same. And we try to, as I just said, we try to help fintechs through the procedures, but we cannot play a very active advisory role because that's not permitted for us. And thus, when we talk to fintechs or look at fintechs, we look at the risks, just like we look at risks at any other firm. So we treat all firms the same when they try to come into the regulatory scope. And we look at the business and the risks, and then the same rules apply that would apply for traditional investment firms or banks. that doesn't mean that we don't try to provide assistance, as I just said. And because we do know how difficult it can be to try to find out which license a firm might actually need or which prospectus it might have to apply for, we are working on our communication channels with fintechs right now. We are trying to become more fit for modern times and not to lag too far behind. And therefore, we're improving these communication channels currently. We're trying to, or we're working on having a better overview of the regulatory landscape available for fintechs to be able to have a first assessment of which rules might apply for which type of business model. Of course, such overviews can never be completely on point and can answer every last question because many questions are case-by-case decisions. But we're trying to set up our homepage in a new way to facilitate these things for the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. This sounds exciting. Perhaps something like an open channel for fintechs is opening now. But let's continue with Bundesbank. This characterizes the German regulatory framework. 2 regulators, not only one.
Yes, but I think I can explain, let's say, what is the added value of the Bundesbank's oversight to Claire's supervision. With Claire, a fintech can get a license or can learn anything that is needed around licensing. However, many businesses of fintechs, many services, they in fact do not need a license. Nevertheless, the fintechs enter the payment service value chain as service providers, as enablers in many parts. And this is where the oversight comes into play. The oversight function means the Bundesbank is looking at the payment system, not at the institution, but at the system. And we are looking at schemes like, say, SEPA scheme or instant payment schemes, and we look at instruments. And indeed, let's say, any credit transfer, any debit, even a card payment is an instrument from that perspective. And if we look at this, well, we have to make sure that when new service providers, such as fintechs, come in, the safety and efficiency of payments of the payment system is still kept. So our focus is safety and efficiency in the use of instruments. And for that, we work heavily, we contribute heavily to the Secure Pay Forum at European level, where all supervisors and overseers gather and where we come up with guidelines, for instance, for internet payments that have already found its way into BaFin regulation. So this is the angle where we are coming from. And we love competition. We love competition in payment systems. And therefore, we are also, let's say, very happy to see that with the Payment Services Directive, the 2nd edition, we are getting more competition. We just have to make sure that, let's say, payments stay still safe and efficient.
Thank you so much. I learned from this that payments are in the focus of Bundesbank, but there are much more areas of activity, as we all know. Financial data, banking solutions, lending, marketplaces, and so on. And now I think it's very interesting to learn from our entrepreneurs what is their perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here. My name is Joachim Schmidt. I'm the co-founder of BaNCALIS, a technology startup here from Frankfurt. And our goal is to make banking regulation easy. So
this is your pitch now.
So what we are working on is a cognitive self-learning system that automatically analyzes where financial institutions are affected by new laws. How can this work? We are working on an algorithm which compares the new regulation to the data of the banks and to the internal documentation of the banks. So what we are able to is to see immediately the internal impact where a part of the regulation comes into, but we also can see the gap analysis. We don't think that the amount of regulation is a problem. We think it's the way how we deal until now with regulation. To have a look on fintech, I think a lot of fintech startups right now, they build up new banking solutions from a completely new perspective, from the perspective of the customer. So of course they have new approaches and they have new digital solutions to deal with this. And of course, these solutions are not somehow in this regulatory framework right now, because I think it's not completely evaluated right now how they have to be regulated. So I think before we speak about regulation for fintechs, we have to speak about the risks which can get out for consumers from these services and also for the business. And then I think right now it's much more in the hands of the fintech startups by themselves to establish a risk and compliance management to be one step ahead of the regulator. Because somehow, of course, the regulator will come and look at the risks and will implement regulations. And if the startups by themselves see the risks which are arising out of the business, they can prepare for this.
This sounds very ambitious, to be one step ahead of the regulator, especially for small startups. Let's continue with Figo's perspective.
Yeah, thanks for having me here too. André Bajorat, CEO from Figo, a fintech startup in Germany. We are building something like a banking service provider, and maybe that's a role which is absolutely needed for a lot of startups. And so our role is maybe absolutely in the focus of the regulation, and maybe at the Bundesbank and the payment too. Absolutely, and we know it, and that's not a big problem, because the problem is at the moment more and more. From my perspective, that's not so easy to get the right people on the table for fintechs like us. It's not so easy it's very easy to phone the BaFin or the Bundesfinanzministerium, but to get the right people on the table is not the easiest way, because we are only a fintech, and that's maybe sometimes a big problem. And it's not so easy to say some new things after the four people before me, but from my perspective, we are inside a fundamental change how people are using banking and how people are using banks, and that's very digital. And from my perspective, that's players are there who doesn't fit in the existing models and roles, and that's the biggest issue, I think, at the moment, that nobody knows, is there a regulation for me or not for me? And I think that's the biggest issue in the moment for most of the new players. They have to find out if there is a need for regulation or not, and I think that's an issue for all of us, that there is that there must be a place that all the people come together and to have a discussion about these things, and I think that's what we need.
Yeah. I think there's a broad consensus on the panel about the necessity of regulation, consumer protection, and so on. But there's no consensus how the regulators and the ministry deal with fintechs. There needs something like a discussion place, an open channel, something like this. Is there anything? Yeah, Dr. Holle, please.
When I listened to this gentleman to the right of me, I thought perhaps we need one addition to this startup. If I understand this startup, what this startup does is it takes existing companies and new regulation and analyzes what new regulation means for the existing company.
But only for banks. He's doing it for banks. So.
As every startup, I'm sure he wants to grow, so perhaps later on we'll see more of that. What we need, in a sense, is a startup which comes to us and say, how do new companies and new business models affect existing regulation? That's a different question. Because the existing regulation works in a way we've got established types of corporation. We know a bank takes deposit, gives loans, insurance company does this. We've got, I would say, very detailed and fairly complex legislation for all of these. And then the new entrants on the markets with a new business model are challenged to navigate their way through this and find into which box do I belong. If it's easy and quick, they know into which box they belong, and then the next question is, do we have to do everything on paper, or could we move to more modern channels? But the more difficult thing is that usually it's not clear in what exact box do they fit, and they pose new questions. So I think for this, it's absolutely important that we get this dialogue going and better going, so that both sides can navigate better, that new businesses know which areas of existing legislation are relevant for us, and that the legislator and regulator does know these are the new business models, these are new issues we need to think about, and how do we address them? I think that's extremely important.
So is it thinkable that BaFin or Bundesbank acts like a consultant for fintechs?
Well, speaking for this work? Yeah. Speaking for BaFin, we cannot function as consultants, as I said at the beginning, just because we don't have such an advisory role. But what we are doing is currently trying to set up specific archetypes of typical fintech businesses and try to, and we're matching the existing regulation with these new businesses to adapt it to these new models to see which rules need to apply. But the thing is, fintechs have very diverse business activities, so that will only be able to provide a broad indication of whether a certain firm's business will require a license or another requirement. In the end, it will always be a case-by-case decision that we will have to take. We will need to look at the applications or at the business models and then take the decision. Just because the legal framework is very detailed and very complicated, and well, it's just not possible to have broad categories and just to decide abstractly which firm fits where.
Yeah. Maybe are there some best practice examples maybe that's a good solution for other startups to look at the Formula One and then to see how the BaFin and how the rules fits to their business models, because that's maybe a first step to get more knowledge in this field.
What do you think from Bundesbank's perspective?
We are having already this dialogue, but more, let's say, on a bilateral basis. There is no specific format to this, but I'm of course happy, let's say, to give my phone number.
Okay.
But let's say, maybe it's a good idea to get this organized, and I would also look to Levin and the ministry, because probably Berlin, Frankfurt, yes, let's say we have to bring this together, and maybe we can do this at a national level. Say something like a National Payments Council, something, let's say, where banks, fintechs, and let's say the regulators get together, because let's say the fintechs are part of the value chain. They are maybe enabling the access to payment instruments. They kind of do not execute the transaction, because for this they would have needed a license. However, they facilitate, they initiate the transaction. And so we have to look at this in a systematic manner. Yes, we would be open to such a dialogue. Yeah, we can organize that. Why not?
But we have to organize it. I think what we need is an organization for this dialogue,
Okay,
a channel or something like this.
If it's the meeting room and an agenda, the Bundesbank is happy to provide that.
And fixed times, perhaps, just fixed times. Yeah, please, a question from the audience, please.
The question is, to whom do you talk to if you want to regulate fintechs? Are you talking to traditional banks, or do you have a specific person that you can contact, like an association? So I think that's probably one of the main issues, that there's no representative of the fintech group, which has different interests than traditional banks, most probably.
Are there specialists for fintechs in?
I think there were some new kinds of there were something like organizations of some fintechs together in the German startup groups. There were some initiatives, and they're working a little bit together. But I think it's there must be somewhere who's responsible to get these people all together. I think there were some meetings in the Bundesfinanzministerium months ago, I think 2 or 3 months ago, that I think a good start, and to bring more and more of these people together. I think that's a good idea. I think we need the person who's responsible to get these. The meeting room is cool, the phone number too, but I think there must be one person or one organization to bring these people on one table.
Yeah, and a competent counterpart, so which has to be paid. Yeah.
I think what we should not forget are the banking associations. Like Mr. Kammerer said, that they also want to build a forum for fintech startups. So I think they are in the perfect position to help the startups, because they also help the banks. So why not?
Dr.
But probably it's your job to get organized. Bundesverband Deutscher Fintechs, yeah, does not yet exist.
This last sounds a little bit horrible.
I think what we need in reality are two types of improvements in communication. One is indeed having a more organized format at a higher level, where you look at the broad picture, identify main challenges, and get a dialogue and exchange going. There are a number of initiatives. We had at least 4 or 5 rounds in the ministry. We've got several ongoing which are slotted already, so that's all happening. It is indeed less established because there's no Bundesverband Fintech or something like that, but I'm not so sure whether that alone would solve the issue because the industry is developing so rapidly, it's so broadly active, which is why I think what we also need is the second piece, which in a way is below this and which really makes sure that individual or groups of fintechs which have similar issues know rapidly and quickly and get a qualitative dialogue going with the supervisors and regulators directly responsible for them. I think that's the other part. I think so there's a sort of a national industry type dialogue in which we also need to include the existing businesses, because a lot of this, what happens in terms of innovation, some of it is competition, some of it is cooperation and will lead to cooperation with existing types of financial services institutions, so we need that. I think what we also need is a clear path for individuals or smaller groups to know who are my relevant counterparts and what sort of dialogue can we get going, because it is not the type of business where you know this is the box I need to fit in and I just need to fill out this paper and that's it. It's very different, so we need a very different and more intense type of interaction.
Yeah, and I think this leads to an overall question. We talked a lot about the regulatory framework and its necessity, but I think the crucial question is how can we make Germany more attractive as a fintech hub in cooperation with the regulators? What is your perspective? I have seen you.
No, I think it was in the last or in the I think in the last discussion to build something like a hub for the German fintech scene or something in Frankfurt or Berlin or wherever. I think that is absolutely needed in the moment that we need a place where all these fintechs and all these knowledge could be there could be exchange of all this knowledge. I think that's absolutely the important point at the moment, that we need a hub for this.
Yeah, which bundles together.
And then the exchange of knowledge and a good relationship with the regulator, with the ministry, and all these things. And I think that's in the moment in London perfect for all the fintechs. That's the reason why so many fintechs are in London. That's not only the guys who are bankers before. Yeah. That's the regulation too, and I think that's needed. But I think for this we need something like a hub.
Yeah, but I think there's one question from the audience, or 2 questions from the audience, please.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Prince Mobake from Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. My question is for BaFin, and it's linked to the digitalization of the regulation of the registration of fintech, because it seems like nowadays it's difficult to get registered in short time. Sometimes it can take 1 year for a fintech company to be registered. My question is, because you say that there is many discussion inside BaFin in order to improve the process, what have you planned about it in order to make easier for fintech company to get registered? Thank you.
Okay. First of all, as I said before, the same rules that apply for traditional firms need to apply for the fintechs as well. So, there's no way around a fintech fulfilling all the regulatory requirements.
Regulation light?
Yeah. Well, I would have to pass that question on to the legislator, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But for now, that's the situation. And traditional firms' applications sometimes also take a longer period of time. It always depends on the application and whether it's complete or whether we have a lot of questions and how quickly we can solve all the open issues. And of course, for fintechs, right now, because we're still at a starting point, often there's a lot more open questions than with the traditional firms, because it's a new business model and because there's many new questions that we need to solve. Like, for example, the question how traditional rules apply to robo-advice, for example, investment advice provisions that we have. How do we apply these to these new business models? And that's why sometimes a couple of discussions or additional rounds of questions will be necessary in an application process. But of course, we're trying to speed up things, and we try to sit down with the firms once they apply for a license to try to deal with the open questions as quickly as possible, and then to try to find the fitting solution.
I think there was another question. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Patrick Bird. I'm running a fintech in Berlin. There's one question that I always wanted to ask since the financial crisis happened, and I wanted to ask it to the Minister of Finance. Now Levin is here, so I give it a chance to ask him instead. Financial regulation in Germany is always looked at as this consumer protection. You can also look at it as sort of empowering market forces in the sense that the banks have new players that they have to interact with and compete with, and have to force them to change in a way. And the FCA in the UK is doing this pretty radically. So one example is when you apply for a consumer loan with a traditional bank and you're being rejected based on their scoring system, there's an obligation to the bank to send you to a P2P lending platform instead. So I think I was always wondering, I think a chance there to sort of use this as a political instrument as well. I mean, I'm not expecting a press conference statement here, but sort of what is the thinking there, I guess?
Happy to answer that, and I think it's also important, and that I think also goes to one of your questions in your first statement. I think we need to keep things in proportion. If we ask what is the importance of fintech in Germany, it is correlated in a sense, I would say, not so much to how are the regulators behaving, but it is correlated as a starting point from what importance does which industry have on a global scale if we compare it with other countries. And I think that relates to your question. Fintech is digital and IT related. If we look at that, it's clear the main point of action right now are the United States. We have talked about a lot of small fintechs, innovative ideas, some very large digital companies, Google, Apple, whatsoever, are in the United States, are thinking about what to do in financial services. So I think that's certainly something which we need to keep in mind, at least in the payment area. If we look at financial services, again, on a global basis, it's the United States. If you look at Europe, the market in the UK is very different and much larger. Also, if you look at the role of market players, if you compare London to Frankfurt in terms of financial services professionals, there's a very clear difference. I think it's only natural that these two markets also lead the development in terms of fintechs. Now, what does this mean from a policy perspective for the German market? And I think it explains also a bit the different approach. If we look at the market, at least for retail consumers, and I think that was what your question was about, if you talk about consumer loans, it is clear that the United Kingdom has a much more concentrated market. If you look at market shares, if you look at existing pricing in the United Kingdom, I would say on average already with the existing offers here in Germany, where the market is much more fragmented, competition is much more intense, prices are lower for consumers, rates are lower, so there's a different consumer situation. At this point in time, I would not argue that there's a clear evidence that in Germany we don't have enough competition in terms of average retail banking products on the market. I think there's a lot, and if you talk into other halls during this week with established companies, they will talk about cost issues and scale issues and so forth on the German market. And so it's reasonable that in the United Kingdom there are some very concerted efforts to bring more competition onto these markets because the market is so concentrated. Not only consumer loans, you can see that in SME lending. I think these are areas which on average and on balance, if I look at SME lending, for instance, have worked well in the German economy throughout the financial crisis. So I think that's not the parts which need urgent fixing. On the other hand, I think we should also see, as I said in my opening statement, the chances. There is a lot of innovation. There's a huge improvement potential in convenience for consumers, access to new services. So I think we should focus on these parts. I would think it's not the right political answer to say, well, we put more competition to these market participants and promote the other ones. I think that's something the market should decide. But I think we should enable level playing field, and that includes that new market entrants have a fair chance of a rapid market access. And I think that's the part which we need to focus on to get legislation and then regulation and supervision and approval up to speed, so that those who have new ideas, who bring new services, new convenience to consumers, are able to compete quickly. And that's a big chance. I mean, if, for instance, look at the, I think this year we had the first piece of legislation in the Bundestag where specifically we actually had a debate, don't we need to do this differently in the digital age? That was the question around crowdfunding. The way the law came was in a traditional way, and it said, you know, if you want to sell an investment product to someone, you need to tell him what the risks are, and you want a paper-written signature to confirm that he has understood that. So that's, you know, that was the traditional box-by-box approach, which went through. Into the legislative process, that was changed, and said we need to recognize that today consumers don't only sign papers, they read it on the internet, so we need a digital way to deal with that. But that's a long process, and I think it's important to speed that up so that we've got new market entrants quickly on the market to provide their services, and that will, I think, will be beneficial to competition and to consumers as well.
Yeah, I think level playing field is a very good keyword. We all know that today countries, not only like the UK, but even the Czech Republic, Netherlands, Ireland, are more attractive for fintechs than Germany, what I learned from the ranking of Barkov Consulting last week. So how can we attract Germany as a hub for fintechs? What can we do in addition to what we already discussed to establish a hub and so on? Anything else?
I think we are doing a lot at the moment from the fintech side, and I think talents and ideas are there, and absolutely. To look a little bit to the other countries and to see that the competition with UK and Luxembourg and some other countries,
Prague
maybe, that's good. And in the payment area, there are a lot of German companies who moved to Luxembourg or to Malta or something, and maybe
crowd financing up.
Yeah, and I think that's something we have to focus on. That Germany is not the hardest regulator or the toughest regulator, and then maybe that's what we have to do. So that's good for fintechs to be here and to use the German economy and to build companies here in the country. Yes.
Mr. Metzger.
Yeah, André, I can follow you to some extent, because maybe the most important value proposition for fintech in Germany is kind of the access to bank accounts or the access to payments, the initiation of payments. And in this particular part of the business, when we talk about initiation, enabling access, identification becomes an issue. How do you identify yourself? And if the only way of doing this is the post-ident way of doing it, the customer will never sign up. This is for me the biggest difference between Luxembourg and Germany, that in Luxembourg you can do this via email, copy of your passport, something else, and in Germany you need a post-ident. Of course, there's also some attractive parts of the taxation in Luxembourg, but leaving taxation apart, for me the identity thing is probably something we could single out for thinking about how to improve.
In the UK too, yeah, there it's very easy to identify a person, absolutely, yeah, and that's one of the reasons.
Okay, a last question from the audience, if it's allowed. But please be short, because...
No, my question is to BaFin. We talk about payments sector a lot, and there seems to be a legal void here, because a lot of payment companies operate under the umbrella of financial institutions and banks. So how does BaFin establish a control over threats such as money laundering? Because fintechs providing payment services, how do you ensure that things like money laundering or any other antisocial activities don't happen? Because there seems to be no dedicated regulations for fintech at this point of time, at least.
I think for this question, I will also have to pass on to my colleague. For me, I can just say very generally that, well, if the activity falls within the regulatory scope and it's the activity of the fintech and not the bank, then the fintech needs to fulfill all the requirements, and then they wouldn't be able to circumvent any anti-money laundering provisions. It's just the fact that someone's a fintech would not mean that the rules don't apply. So, but of course, the advantage of cooperations between banks and fintechs is often that the regular, the activity that requires regulation stays with the bank, which already has a license and needs to fulfill all the regulatory obligations anyway, and that of course is also an acceptable model, because then we also supervise the relevant activities.
And the banks act like a fronting bank for the fintech. Yeah.
As an overseer, we are not entirely happy with this particular model because we can end up in a situation, let's say, where the efficiency and safety of the payments is in danger, and the bank says we are not responsible, and the fintech says we are not responsible too. There is, let's say, the tendency of a gap to open. Therefore, probably I would rather encourage a fintech to find a model whereby itself does not consider licensing as a nuisance, but rather thinks how, let's say, to get a license, and of course, how to apply anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist financing rules itself, and not only hide behind the bank.
Yeah. Unfortunately, our time is over, but I think what we learned from the panel is that the doors are open. They are open for a dialogue between the ministry, the policymakers, the regulators, and the entrepreneurs, and there are now really a lot of initiatives in Germany, in Berlin, Frankfurt, and other. And what we now need is to bundle them and to establish 2 or 3 hubs in Germany for fintechs. Thank you very much to the panel and to the audience, and let's continue this interesting conference. Thank you. Thanks.